Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk a little bit about communication and some of the different ways and theories for how it functions. Now, if we're going to go forward and think about communication critically, we have to really understand the foundations of how it actually works, what it is, and the different ways in which and factors that influence whether or not you're successful in your communication. So let's dive in here a little bit. So again, communication is defined as how people use messages to generate meaning within and across various contexts, cultures, channels, and media. And, it's a process. You're providing information to another person. You're trying to create a shared understanding about some object or idea that you can have between your minds, right? So this process is one that has a fair number of different sort of components to it. So first off, I would say it's a process. Communication is not something that you do immediately and it's done. Very often it's a process by which you make a statement, someone asks a question, people think about it, they might come back to it at a later time, and you're gathering information and the other person's gathering information throughout that to sort of understand what the communication is about. Communication is often also social. So usually the idea is that you're talking to somebody else in some way or another. We don't normally think of when we talk to ourselves or think to ourselves, we don't normally think of that as communicating with ourselves. We usually think about this communication more as something where we're interacting with another, either directly or indirectly. Communication is also symbolic, right? So very often we use words that represent something or images that represent something in the real world. It's not common that we're communicating by the actual thing that we're engaging with or we're trying to discuss, right? So we use different ideas and concepts that are essentially symbols for what we're trying to address. Communication is also meaning, right? So we can say a lot of different things. We can say exactly the same word, and it can have a wide range of different meanings. And not only can it have a wide range of different meanings, it can have a wide range of different meanings to other people, right? So, their understanding of the meaning of a word or an idea is going to influence how that communication goes, right? And then communication is also the environment that you're in. The environment will influence where you are, what you're doing, will dramatically influence what you're saying means to the other person, right? So how you would respond to somebody saying, I want to play, will be different if you're sitting in an orchestra versus if you're sitting out in a playground, right? These contexts, this environment makes a difference to what communication means to another. So there are a lot of factors that influence when communication works or doesn't work, right? It really relates to who's listening, how they're listening, what's being said and how it's being said, right? So the cartoon here, this person is complaining to their dog and they think that they're saying a very complete thing to the dog and the dog is just hearing their name repeatedly, right? So what we say is not necessarily what other people hear and understand. So just another illustration of this. So imagine I said to you, I want you to imagine an automobile, right? So you might imagine a car, but you also might imagine a bus, or you might imagine a tractor. There could be a lot of different automobiles that you might gravitate towards. So you might say, all right, so what kind of automobile are you talking about? So I say, all right, I'm talking about a car. And then you might say, well, what does that car look like, right? Well, I say it's red and black. Now, we might think that we have an understanding here, but your interpretation, what actually comes up in your head might look very different. Up at the top, you see there's a black and red sports car. You'll see that's mostly black and just a tiny bit of trim in red. You could also see more of a normal sedan car that's an electric car. You know, one's gas, one that's electric. And it is mostly red with a little bit of black, right? So even though we said use the same words, and even in this context, maybe we had the same understanding, we could have a very wide difference of view in terms of what we're actually visualizing in our heads. Now that could be even broader, right? So someone might think, well, if they're thinking about a car, maybe what they're really interested in is toy cars. So they might have a toy car that's red and black in their head. Or maybe they think about art a lot and their interest is in art. So here's a picture of an old antique car that's red and black. Or maybe they just entirely misunderstood you. Maybe they thought you said star, right? And not car. So in their head, they're visualizing a red and black star, right? So there's all different ways in which we can communicate and actually not get across what we have in our head. And that's something that we always struggle with because, you know, the reality is that we don't always share meaning and the understanding of the world in the context that we think within. So one way to sort of systemize this is called the semantic triangle. So the semantic triangle is the idea that we all have concepts in our head that refer to some sort of object or idea or thing of some sort. And that's a referent, right? And in order to do that, to engage with that, we have symbols that refer to that referent, right? And it stands for that referent. And we use the word like cat, for example, that goes into our head and we create an image of a cat of some sort, right? So this is the process by which we use to negotiate between symbols, reference, and our concepts. And there's plenty of room for people to interpret this differently. So just an example of this, what about the word Mustang? So if I said, I talked about, I'm going to go see a Mustang. Well, if someone knew, for someone who's listening to you, if they happen to be someone who works with a lot of horses, they might think, well, that's a horse. But if there's someone who likes cars a whole lot, they might think that you're going to go look at a Mustang, which is a name of a certain type of car, right? So depending on where someone's coming from, they could engage with this symbolic thing and concept meaning triangle in a different way. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the process of communication. And the reason we want to do this is to give us some ideas around where the different ways in which communication is complex and in which what we can generate those different types of meanings given different people's perspectives. So for a long time, what was often used in communication theory was the idea of linear communication. So here's a model. There's a sender and there's a receiver, right? So the sender says something like, I want to go on a walk. And the receiver received that message. That person wants to go on a walk, right? Now, there could be some noise in this. Maybe there's factors that influence whether that person understands that to be, for example, request that they go on a walk with them or not. The noise essentially is in this idea, in this concept, is that there will be some variation in terms of how that message is received based upon the receiver and what their understanding of what's being said, right? So someone might think, in one case, they might say, oh, does that person want to go on a walk with me or not? Whereas, in another circumstance, they might think, well, that person is really saying they want to get out of here and go on a walk and get away, right? So there's different factors, this noise in a communication that makes a difference between what the sender and receiver perceives of that message. But it's a pretty linear relationship. Well, there's some problems with this way of viewing communication. One is that it's linear, right? It assumes that there's a single message being conveyed, right? It goes from one person to another. But most communication is actually messages in two directions. So one message could be, I want to go on the walk. And the sender could actually see that this person is not understanding what they're saying just by the expression on their face. which is also a form of communication. And they might say, well, I want to go on a walk by myself, right? The other thing is that it assumes that there's only one message being conveyed. So you can say one thing and mean two things. So people can be sarcastic, for example. They can say a range of things that they might be saying one thing which could be literally interpreted, like, oh yeah, you're so great. Well, someone could interpret that as being, well, you're so great, or you could interpret that as being, this person really doesn't think I'm so great, right? So, sometimes there's multiple messages going on, and some messages could be verbal, and some messages could be body language. So somebody says, you're so great in a positive way, but their look on their face is a scowl. You're really getting two different messages at once. And this model really does understand that messages evolve over time. The idea that messages and communication is a process that is often has feedback and changes as we go forward. So another model for thinking about communication, which is more recently used, it's called the transactional model of communication. And this is a very extensive chart. Don't worry about the chart too much right now because we're going to go through it step by step. But this is a model that sort of thinks about communication in a more complex way, as a wide range of different complex interacting ideas and concepts and sort of factors that influence the conveyance of information between two communicators. Okay, so let's walk through what this model is designing. So first off, in this model, there's two communicators. Now, of course, there can be more than two communicators, but just for this purpose, we're going to use two, right? So we can have communicator A and communicator B, okay? Now, those communicators are providing messages back and forth between them, right? So they say one thing to one communicator says one thing to another. The other person is responding in feedback to the other person. So that's the exchange that's occurring there. And again, the idea here being that there was two directions. Now, there's elements to this which are also important. So there's terms behaving, encoding, and decoding. So behaving is also the behavioral element to that communication, but there's also encoding and decoding. So a communicator will encode a message. So they have an idea, some concept that they want to create, and they're going to pick out words, phrasing, grammar to provide that message to somebody else. And that's a process of encoding a message, okay? Now, the other communicator, the other person being engaged, is going to then decode that message, right? So the term decoding is referring to the process of taking a message and pulling it apart to create their own concept of what was being said. Now, that communicator in turn is then going to create a response where they're going to encode that response in some form, and then it will be provided back to the other communicator, right? So communication is this exchange of encoding and decoding, right? Now, communication actually occurs through a wide range of different mechanisms, right? So sight, sound, taste, touch, speaking, writing, and television, telephone, letters, face-to-face, music, all those different things, ways, mediums for providing that message to go back and forth. And very often there's multiple modes of communication going on at exactly the same time. So body language at the same time as words is really important. People actually pay a lot of attention to body language, or the tone at which someone's saying something makes a huge difference in what's being said. If someone says something in a relaxed and calm tone, you can have a very different interpretation of what they're saying than if somebody is really anxious and is yelling at you, right? So the other elements of this model that I think is really helpful is recognizing that different communicators are operating with a different field of experience. So you're seeing two ovals here. And this is recognizing that two different people in an exchange, in the communication, are different people. They've had different experiences in their lives, all right? They have a different background. They have different interests. They have different vocabularies. And therefore, when you're communicating between people, they're going to be operating from a different perspective, right? Now, they may also have a shared perspective. So the idea here of the ovals overlapping, right, is that you can actually have an overlap in people's experience. So usually if you're having two people talking to one another in the same language, that implies that they have some shared experience in that they are speaking in the same language, right? So there will be overlap that people are engaging with, and that's the overlap that that facilitates communication, right? But you also can't assume that there's too much overlap because people do come from different perspectives, right? Now, related to that is the idea that as people are engaging in encoding and decoding and communicating, creating those messages, those are all influenced by culture, education, experiences, moods, emotions, all the different factors that are encompassed in our field experience that make up our identities, right? So the types of words that we use, how we structure them, those are all things that are influenced by where we come from, right? Now I want to get to the idea of noise. So noise is the idea that in that engagement, there are a range of different things that influence how this occurs, right? And essentially are elements that can reduce our ability to actually effectively communicate. They create interruption in the communication of meaning, right? So noise can come from a wide range of different sources. Some of it's context, and some of it's things related to characteristics of the person themselves, right? So I've already talked about how the space that you're in, the situation that you're in, can actually influence how you understand something. So saying, I want to play in a playground versus I want to play in an orchestra is going to mean something different. So the physical situation you're in, the context. It can also be the people that you're with, so the social elements in your surroundings. There could be physical elements to noise. So it could be misunderstandings of hearing, for example. So it could be your physical, maybe you're have trouble hearing what somebody else is saying, right? So that's the example of the star that I gave before. Maybe someone just misunderstood what you're saying because of challenges with hearing, right? So you have age, culture, one's gender, education, religion, mood, memory, attitude, technology. All these different things can introduce elements to this. So when you think about technology, for example, texting is something that we all do. And we've all had exchanges through texting that maybe didn't go so well because the way that we understood, for example, using caps as being yelling versus just an emphasis or in some way is actually something that is a cultural understanding of how this technology is used that is influenced by the technology and its use, right? And understanding of how to use that technology. So these are all things that can influence how one creates that intersecting space between people's field of experience and effectively communicating between them. So I know that this is theoretical, right? But I hope that it kind of resonates with our understanding of the complexity of our communications. Like we've all had things not go very well. And I think that this is useful for starting to piece out why are we not succeeding at communicating, right? So is it that we're not communicating because someone has a different experience than us? Is it because they're not hearing us? Is it because they're interpreting a different situation to this than what I understand? And this sort of gives us opportunities as we think about this to see the different ways in which we might have challenges in communication, but also see opportunities for communicating better with others. Because we can sort of, before we design a communication, especially if we have time to plan it, we can think about who we're trying to communicate and try and customize what we say to what they need and what they're interested in, right? So it's actually kind of a useful model for thinking about this, in my opinion. Now, there's actually a range of different factors that influence communication itself, all right? And in many ways, communication at multiple levels really is in our heads. It's in our minds. There's a lot of different things that go on in our brains that influence how we engage with ideas that we encounter. So I'm going to go through a few of different ones to consider. So the first off is just talking about how people engage with new information. How do they respond to this message that they're getting? Some sort of stimuli, be it a message or something that they're interacting with, right? So first off, people, as they're engaging with the stimuli, they select specific stimuli. So very often they don't always select all of it, right? They pick out the components to it that they pay attention to and notice. And this is influenced by a range of different factors. There's internal factors like who they are as a person. And then there's also external factors like, how novel that information is, how much it stands out to someone or how familiar they are with it. When someone gets that information, they then organize it, right? So they try and take the information and put it in a context and create a pattern out of it, right? So they might try and figure out how it fits as it being similar to other things that they know about or think about, or the context in which they're putting it in, right? So this is how people engage with new information or ideas or words that they, or communications that they encounter. In this organization of the things that they're engaging with, they then attach meaning to it. So they take this, this sentence, for example, that they encounter, and they try and interpret what it's supposing to say. What is the overall meaning of what's being said to them, right? And there's a bunch of different biases that can distort this, that can influence whether or not they understand this well or not. And then the individual respond to it. And this is will lead to a range of different responses. Some will be things that you can't detect, which will be covert responses. So they'll have things that go on in their own head in terms of how they respond to it. And then there'll be some things that they actually do. Sometimes they'll behave. And the behavior might be responding with words themselves, or they might do something. And this is a process, and where we can continue through that cycle of engaging with the stimuli that we engage with in the world around with us, right? So that's what we're doing in engaging in communication. Now, when we think about factors that influence this process, there's a few different biases or elements to this that are important to be aware of. And these start to get into the different factors that influence how successful we are at communicating about something with someone else. So there's a theory called attribution theory. And this is how we think about somebody else as they're communicating with us. So when someone says something to us, do we attribute what they're saying to who they are as a person? Do we see it as an indicator of who they are? Or do we attribute it to external causes, right? So remembering back to the model that I showed you earlier about someone's field of experience, do we attribute to their personal culture, characteristics, their own self-concept? Do we think that this says something about that person themselves? Or do we think it's due to the context they're in, whether they're at a party or at school, for example, right? Are we thinking that this is an external influence on them, right? So the ways that there's different factors that influence whether we choose to describe something that somebody does as being their responsibility and something they did, or something that's externally forced on them, right? One is distinctiveness. So does this person behave in this manner in other situations, right? So if they don't behave in this manner in other situations, that influence whether or not you think that this might be something that's pushed on them, right? Another is consensus. Do other people behave in this manner? Well, if other people behave in this manner, it might feel like it's something that's influenced from outside. It's peer pressure or something like that. Another is consistency over time. So does this person repeatedly behave this way? All right. Now you can look at it in a chart here. So if you look at somebody's behavior as you're looking at something, messages somebody's sending by what they do or what they say, if the distinctiveness is high, you might have an external attribution, whereas if it's low, it might be internal. Same for consensus and consistency. High external, low internal. So let's talk about this a little less theoretically speaking. Okay, so let's say that you see somebody, your friend, and you see somebody smoking. Your friend Jamal is smoking at a party, for example. All right. So you could say, is this something that he usually does? Or is this something distinctive, something that seems consistent with who he is, right? If it's distinct or seems unusual, you might, and therefore being high, you might say that he's smoking because it's a situation, right? That's causing this, right? Or if it's low, if it seems consistent, then you might assume that it's something that's representative of him. It's something that he does, right? There could also be consensus, right? So what is everybody else doing? If everybody else is doing this, right, you might assume, well, everybody else is doing it, so maybe he's just doing it because everybody else is doing it. Whereas if he's standing out by doing it, you kind of assume that that's a specific choice to do something different from other people, right? Then there's also consistency, right? So if someone doesn't do this regularly, right, then it would be low consistency, and then you would assume that this is something that maybe is something that's just an outlier. It's not something usual or indicative of who they are, right? Whereas if it's something that's high consistency, they do it regularly, you'd assume that's sort of part of their identity and who they are, right? So that's a way of understanding others' behavior, the signals, what people are saying as they're coming in, and how we attribute them to individuals as we're understanding that communication, again, as we're trying to communicate also across our field of experience. Now, there's something that we need to be aware of as a bias here, which is the fundamental attribution error, right? So I just talked about how we attribute different behaviors or ideas or statements to people based upon different factors, right? Now, it turns out that we tend to be less than generous in how we attribute things to other people, whereas we're more generous to ourselves, right? So when, for example, let's use an example here. So if somebody else shows up to a meeting and they're late, and they say, oh, I'm late. Well, we don't really know anything about them or why they're late. So it's very common for you to attribute this to something internal to them. So we might say, well, this person is late. Our interpretation of the meaning might be, this person's late because they're careless, all right? So it's an internal factor to this person, right? However, when we are late, we tend to attribute it to external factors. So we tend to say, well, I'm late because there was traffic, right? There's something that happened to me that made me late, all right? So this is the fundamental attribution error, all right? Now, what's interesting about this is this is a scenario when something is good, right? Or something is bad, right? So we tend to attribute internal traits to others when something is bad, and external traits to ourselves when something is bad. However, if something is good, there's also a risk that we will attribute, we'll say that we succeeded at something because of something related to ourselves, something that we worked really hard and we're really brilliant, right? And that's why we succeeded. Whereas very often with others, we say that someone got a promotion just because they're friends with somebody else, right? Or some other factor that, that caused this to come to being, right? So this is a cognitive bias about how we respond to messages and information input as we're engaging with others, right? And again, this helps us to understand when mistakes occur in communication, right? These are things that we all do to some level or another. There's another idea, which is cognitive dissonance, right? So cognitive dissonance is the idea that there's alignments between different factors. One is what we do, and the other is what we think. And the idea here is that we think certain things about certain things, and yet we do different things in some circumstances. And the idea of cognitive dissonance is when our beliefs are different than our behaviors. That creates a stress for people, that there's a tension that's caused when we believe something but we do something different. Now, this is a theory. I will note that the evidence for this theory is varied in terms of how big of an impact this has. But what this implies is that when we have a difference between our beliefs and our actions, when there's this inconsistency, that this dissonance leads us to actually do a range of different things. One is we could change our belief. So we could say, all right, I don't believe in smoking. I think it's bad for me, but it feels really good, right? So dissonance, I could change my belief. I could say, well, it's not so bad. I'm really healthy in other ways, and it just kind of balances out, right? So there I changed my belief that smoking is bad. Another thing is I could say, well, I guess I'm going to stop smoking, right? So there I'm changing an action. And that can reduce the dissonance between action and belief. And then the third is that you could change your action perception. So you could say, I'm smoking, but I'm not really inhaling, right? So you could change how you view, I'm just having a lighted cigarette around me, right? Or some way that you change the interpretation of what you're doing to account for that dissonance to help you feel better, right? So this is another bias, another way in which we engage with this communication that colors our perception of these communications. We also have information processing theory. And information processing theory is really revolving around the idea that we're all engaging with massive amounts of information all the time. So let me illustrate this. Our brains are actually astonishingly complex. So let me take the example of what seems to be fairly simple. I'm going to go to a store and buy a piece of clothing, right? Well, going to the store and buying a piece of clothing is actually complicated. One, I'm deciding where to go. I'm also deciding, as I go into the store, I'm looking at tens of thousands of pieces of clothing. And I'm using, sizes and colors and styles and all these different pieces of information that my brain is processing to guide me towards a piece of clothing that I pick out, right? That's guided by a wide range of different preferences and factors. And some of these things actually don't happen consciously in my head. I'm not actually actively making decisions about every single piece of clothing that I see. I'm using sort of short-term preferences that I don't really think about that lead me towards that piece of clothing. And this is because our brains simply can't actually process everything we encounter. There is so much information out there. Our brains have to limit what we actually encounter and engage with. And this is called essentially your brain using heuristics. And heuristics are essentially tricks for managing large amounts of information to simplify complex situations or complex information. In other words, they're essentially mental shortcuts that we employ to make the world that we live in manageable. Now, that's often really useful. So imagine I went to that store and I didn't use heuristics. I actually looked at every single piece of clothing and tried to make an informed decision about every piece of clothing. Well, that would be exhausting and hugely inefficient. I'm very glad I have those heuristics. They're really important to us. But heuristics can often lead us astray in really significant ways. So there's a few of them that I'm going to mention in brief here, just so you're aware of them, because all these heuristics influence that communication between communicator 1 and communicator 2, right? These are all the biases that come into that engagement between fields of experience. So one is selective perception. So here we're interpreting based upon our own viewpoint, background, experience, etc., history. This is where we're engaging with something, and we only see certain things based upon where we're coming from, and that's a problem when somebody else is coming from a different perspective, right? So being able to, although this is a useful heuristic, being able, in some cases, especially when it's important to view from other perspectives, can actually be a tremendously important and valuable skill for us to have. Another is called the halo effect. So you go and you see somebody and they are wearing a hat that's from your favorite team, baseball team, whatever it happens to be. And you say, oh, this person is cool because we have the similarity. And you can make perceptions about a person based upon a single characteristic about them being good or bad. And it creates a halo around them in certain ways, in positive or negative ways, based upon very limited information, right? That's another heuristic that our brain uses. Another effect that we do is we tend to evaluate people by contrasting them with ourselves. Are they better at drawing pictures than us, right? We can very quickly assess them. Are they good or bad based upon something like that, right? And this measure of better or worse does introduce distortions. And so it can be useful for understanding who they are and their place in the world and how good they are at art. But sometimes the process of comparing to yourself can actually interfere with your ability to understand what they're doing and who they are and what that means. So some art that's actually really important and has a lot of thought and meaning behind it looks like a child drew it, and our assessments can introduce bias in terms of how we engage with that without actually really understanding what they're really trying to do with that. Another is projection. So we all come from our own view of the world. We tend to take our own view of the world and our own preferences, etc., and characteristics and project them on other people. And we just assume that they view or do things the way that we do. And that happens all the time with others. And that can lead to a wide range of different types of misunderstandings in communication. Another form of heuristic is representativeness. So this is a little more complicated. This is the idea that we can take characteristics of someone and take them to essentially put them into a specific type based upon our prior experience with other people that have those characteristics, all right? And that's sort of putting somebody into a box. And a form of representativeness is stereotyping. And that's where we say, this person is a lawyer, therefore they are X, Y, and Z, in terms of understanding who they are. Again, this can be useful, but it can not necessarily, it can be very inaccurate because we may not know a lot of things about that person as we're interpreting what they're saying to us, right? Another element to this is availability. So availability is the idea that we're only, very often when we engage with something, we often only use the information that's readily available to us, right? So again, that's the way that we deal with minimizing the huge amount of information that we're engaging with. We use, the quick shorthands. The problem with this is if we judge someone based upon, for example, what all of our friends do, well, our friends may not actually represent people who are different from us, from our culture or group, right? So when we only rely on information that we only have, we have a lot of risk of actually not engaging to understand the other person's experience and context, right? Finally, I'll just note that there's a process in which we also engage with, tend to be biased by anchoring and adjustment. And essentially what this means is when we engage with a piece of information, we tend to create an initial impression of that information. And then as the conversation goes forward, we move from that information. But the first piece of information we get tends to bias us. It tends to be the context in which we view something. Now, for example, if I told you, if I said, what's 8 times 9 times, 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. Whereas I told somebody else, what's 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6 times 7 times 8? Well, if you ask people what the number is, their first guess as to what that number is, the difference is thousands. The person who anchored on 8, where you first said 8 is a higher number, they tend to pick higher numbers. So they're thinking, studies have shown that they often give estimates in the thousands, like 10,000 or so, right? Whereas people who start off where you say, what's 1 times 2 times 3, etc., they tend to guess numbers that are more like 500. And it's just based upon the first number, the first thing that they encounter in that conversation. So these are things that we do, these mental tricks, these mental heuristics that we use that influence how we communicate with others and how we understand what people are saying. I want to also mention that the way that people engage with new information as they're communicating, as they're engaging across their field of experience, is also influenced by how much they are interested in this thing. Now, this isn't the whole model. The elaboration likelihood model sounds complicated, but essentially it is what it's saying. It's saying how likely, when someone's communicating with someone, are they to actually elaborate on that information? Are they actually to think about it? Are they attending to it? Are they paying enough attention to it? Do they understand it well enough that they're actually going to think about that information carefully and process it, right? So if someone engaged with a piece of information and they are engaged with it, they will engage in what we call the central route, where they actually take that piece of information. Let's say you're trying to talk to them about their the risk of climate change, right? So let's say they're really interested with it, and they want to. You're trying to talk about climate change and risk of flooding. Well, they might engage in detail. They might think about where do I live, how close am I to water, and they might then come to plans and ideas around it and collect new information about it, etc. Those are sort of high involvement processing routes, right? Now, the other possibility is they don't really care about climate change, and it's just not something that they either believe in, or it's just not something they think it's far in the future, so it's not relevant to them, right? In those cases, people tend to engage in a peripheral route. And this is sort of low involvement processing, right? What that means is they're usually not thinking about it carefully. They're not using numbers or trying to assess risk or their concerns about it. And therefore, they tend to respond more to other types of factors. So they might respond to a message more based upon, was it jazzy and interesting? Did it have good music with it? Did the person who say it look cool to them, right? And if it's kind of an interesting enough message, in that peripheral route, they might absorb it to some extent. But if it doesn't engage their interest in some way or another, they'll probably just let it by and it will just pass out of their brains, right? So we're all familiar with this sort of element to how communication occurs and whether or not you're successful in actually conveying what you're trying to say to somebody else. All right, so that's a brief introduction to communication and communication theory and the wide range of different factors that influence whether or not we're successful in engaging with other people. Now, this is hugely important because I think that by nature, we have a tendency to view things from our own perspective, as I've talked about throughout this lecture. We tend to engage with communication with others from our own point of view. Now, that's unavoidable, right? We have no infinite knowledge of the world. If everybody understood everything that everybody else is, there might not even be a need to communicate at all, right? So the process of communication, by its very nature, is understanding other people's experience and background and understanding. Now, when it comes to health crises or health issues, we actually have a real obligation to be good at communication. We have a real obligation to be effective in trying to convey what we're saying to one another. When we say it's really important to get testing for COVID, that's not a trivial message. That's a message that has huge implications for other people's lives. So being able to look at, in a more systematic way, how we're communicating and engage in those central roots to really pull apart our own communications and what other people are saying to us is actually a really important skill and tool that we can engage with as we go forward and use to improve our communication. So those are just some ideas for you. I hope they resonate a little bit with our own experiences, because I think we've all experienced these situations. And I hope that you can use them to think a little bit more deeply about how you're communicating in the future and design your communications to actually be more effective for you. So thank you very much. I appreciate you listening. Take care and be well.